Well, speaking of people with little faith, my faith in technology is about to abandon me. So I come over here and I realize that for some reason when I emailed my sermon early this morning to my account so I could pull it up on my little iPad because I'm so impressed with technology. And it didn't email, so I run across an email and then all of a sudden the internet in here doesn't want to work. And Joe and I were just talking about the power of improvisation. So, it says it's working now, so let's see if it comes up here. Something, all right. Let's take up 3 or 4 minutes of the sermon, so. Now we'll download. And then so that I'm not having to rely on it, I have to then copy it to a hard file. I'm looking at the visitors. Visitors are going, oh, well, okay, well, this was interesting. That was a significant moment. I'm sure I am. I'm sure my first point has to do with chaos and things don't go as you planned, and then how do you deal with that? And it seems that no matter what I think about the holy in our midst, the holy is always using me as an illustration. Happy to do so. Thanks. So early in the series, what I mentioned about and what I want to keep trying to play on in this whole series is this idea. I said early on in the first part of the prayer of St. Francis, which, by the way, is on the back of your bulletin if you haven't seen it. It's always back there. It's a great prayer to reflect on. But I said that, that the prayer is set up, like a lot of our scripture, like a lot of our thinking in Western thinking about Christianity and the Western way that we look at things. We have this tendency to set things up as dualistically. The same being true about our suffering. We have a tendency to look at our suffering as being something that happened to us, and therefore we just need to get that fixed so we can get back to the right way things are supposed to go. There's this sort of way in which we see everything dualistically, and even the prayer sort of sets things up dualistically. Where there's hate, let me sow love. Where there's doubt, let me sow faith. As if this idea is they're two completely separate things. And what I mentioned on that first Sunday was that I was thinking that maybe a way to look at this was that hatred, for example, was simply our inability or perhaps our intentional attempts to not see the connections. To not see the connections between us and each other, between creation, ourselves and creation, even in the midst of our own lives, to see all of the connections. That somehow that failure to make the connections is what often divides us from the wholeness, from the wholeness that is God in our midst. So today I want to continue with that idea that that's essentially what we end up doing. This idea that we live in a world that's filled with doubt. That it's not so much a matter of we just don't have enough faith to squash the doubt. That it's really more a matter of we're just not seeing clearly. And I'm going to try to explain that, but hang on to that idea, because that's where I think all of this is really going with the prayer of St. Francis and even with our story of the calming of the storm. So if you look up the root words of doubt, because I always like to play with root words. I think language is so powerful. The whole idea of semiotics, how we make meaning out of things, how we make meaning out of words, how we make meaning out of symbols, is so powerful that we don't even realize how defining and dividing that we are with our language, because we simply grasp hold of language that's familiar to us. And for many of you all who've come to this particular service because you find this service perhaps freeing, or because you find this service open, or because you find this service more reflective, having come from different traditions that were more perhaps limiting, or perhaps judgmental, or perhaps shaming, even the language that I could use in here, for some of you, as it is for me sometimes, to mention certain words out of Orthodox language creates a knot in my stomach. And it's not because I'm afraid of some judgment. It's because I've just had an experience over the years that I can't shake it. The same kind of thing that's natural to our biology, that when we do experience something frightening, we get a little knot in our gut. If we experience something anxious or we worry about something, we get a little knot somewhere. We feel a little bit of a turn somewhere. That same idea. And what I want to suggest is that maybe it's not a matter of separating the two. So look at the root word of doubt, and you come up with fear. That's the root word. Fear or uncertainty. And when you look up faith, which I always used to think of as meaning belief, faith is really simply honesty and trust. Those are the two words that come up most often associated in the Latin roots and the old cognates oriented around this idea of faith. It's not belief. Now, what does that mean in the context of that story if we think about that when Jesus says, do you not have faith yet? Is Jesus saying, do you not believe in me? Do you not believe my teachings? Do you not believe these certain creedal kinds of things that we've been talking about? What does faith mean in that context? In the context of uncertainty, what does faith mean? Now, I'm just going to say quickly, I like things predictable. I like things the way they are. I know some of you have the same seats that you sit in here. We're not even in a traditional church, and you still pick the same seats. I know you do that. Which I'm thinking, that's awesome, because at least now I know where to look for you. If you're here, because sometimes you're not sitting here, and then later on it's like, no, I was there, but you just didn't. I didn't see you where you normally sit. So I'm glad you do that. But I understand that tendency too, because it's our brain. Our brain just likes familiar. Our brain likes routine. And I went to this Indian restaurant that's over off of Hewlin, behind Central Market. It's wonderful. I can't remember the name of it. Wonderful Indian restaurant there. Been there for years. Friends of ours and my wife and I used to go there all the time, weekly. About 3 years ago, we had been going weekly. It was our weekly way to get together with this other couple, and that's where we went. And I always ordered the chicken sarguala. I always ordered that. It just was the most, the mildest of all of the foods. And the owner, who also was the owner of King Tut, the other restaurant, or that other Phoenician restaurant that's over off of Hewlin, far south Hewlin, he would come over and he'd say, I know what you want. You want the chicken sarguala. We hadn't been in a couple of years. And I was like, well, I guess I'm looking forward to going back. I've completely purged myself from that reality. This will be all new. And we walk in and we sit down, and the guy walks over and says, will you be having the chicken sarguala? He remembered. And on the one hand, I thought that was amazing. And then I looked at him and I said, no, I'm going to have the tandoori or whatever. And I just changed it all up completely. But I like that idea of familiarity. We like the idea of routine. We like our same places. We like to sit in the same kind of places that we sit. When I went to see the Book of Mormon with my brother and a bunch of the family, amazing show, irreverent, that's true, but still an amazing show, amazing performance. Huge theater over there at the Opera House over in Dallas, the Winsbury Opera House, and 10 people had seats together, but my brother had bought an extra ticket for one of his friends' who was a last-minute addition. It was for my birthday, and so all the friends after dinner said, so who wants the individual seat? And they were all like, well, I'm not going to sit by myself. So the birthday boy sat by himself. Because I'm a minister. I don't know why I did that. But I sat, the seat was a perfect seat, but it was dead center. 30 seats, it was number 16, number 15, right there in the center. And I'm slightly claustrophobic. I am always intentional about being on an aisle seat. I just want to be able to get out if I need to get out. And so I'm sitting there scooting across all of these people, and then to sort of make a joke, I'm like, I have bladder problems, excuse me, I have bladder problems. Not a one was laughing at me as I was making my way, and I just sat in the middle, and I thought, okay, breathe, breathe. And it was awesome, it was great, but that's not normal for me. I don't like it. was very uncomfortable. We like our comfort, but then there's I mean, these are simple realities, right? These are simple realities, but the reality of uncertainty can be vast and overwhelming. A child, one of our kids could end up turning a direction that's totally self-destructive, and we're completely torn up. We come down with a chronic illness or a terminal illness, and we're completely overwhelmed. We're caught in the crossfire of some struggle overseas, and we're completely overwhelmed. Our reality is completely changed. And we sometimes feel like that psalmist that we heard this morning. Where are you? Where are you, God? I mean, do something, act. What's happened? Or like the disciples in the boat. You're sleeping? It's the middle of a storm, and you're sleeping. Where are you? And we're at times tempted to want to say it wasn't enough faith. Or perhaps to someone who is experiencing that kind of crisis, just have faith. We don't understand God has a purpose. Have faith. And I almost hate bringing this image up, but it just strikes me as this kind of reality. If you'll throw that first slide up there. That was the other one. I forgot. That meant that to go earlier. Yeah. We're going to use this in the future. If you fear change, leave it here. I saw that at a church in Austin. I thought that was awesome. No, the next one. There you go. How many of you remember Mighty Mouse? You practically sing the song in your head, right? Loved that song. Come in there and he'd pick the plane up that was about to crash and he'd carry it down. I mean, he could do anything. And I sometimes wonder if we don't, in generically speaking, if Christians don't have this idea, not just Christians, people of so many different faiths don't have this idea of God being like Mighty Mouse. You know, we're just calling God to come in and save the day. And Jesus turns around and says, you still don't have faith. Not as if to say, if you believed hard enough, maybe I would have done something, but maybe as if to say, if you could see, you'd already have figured this thing out. But the disciples always seemed to get it mixed up. They were always sort of bumbling their way through these stories. There's something about this whole idea of faith that has to do with seeing the connections. And even though we're tempted to ask like the disciples or perhaps like the psalmist, we are tempted to say, where are you, God? It may have to do with the fact that we simply don't know how to look at things. In my thinking, that may be an issue. Fear has a way of shrinking reality. And if we're driven by fear, which we mostly are as creatures, that's one of our primal, most dominant genetic things, is we're driven by fear or doubt or worry or self-doubt or self-criticism or anxieties. It's pretty hard to get past it. I mentioned Thich Nhat Hanh earlier, and he has a great book. He's an amazing teacher, and I think one of the things that he wrote in this book is something worth remembering. The book is entitled No Mud, No Lotus. And the idea is, more than just simplistically, that you can't have the flower without the decay. You can't have the plant without the mud. But it's more this idea of trying to understand that they're one and the same. Look at a flower, he says, and tell me where the cloud is. The cloud is in the blossom, right? You can't have the rain without the condensation. You can't have it without the cloud. The flower isn't going to grow. The tree, look in the tree. Where is all the death and decay? Where is all the sunlight? You can see it in the bark. You can see it in the blossoms on the tree. You can see in the fruit that drops from the tree. You can't have the one without the other. Take it a step further. Tell me if you can't really see, if you can get past our own fear, our own ego, if we can't really see God in one another. Tell me if we can't really see the Creator at the source of creation. creating and moving. Tell me if, in fact, we can't really see the Creator in the heart of the chaos. And I'm not by any means suggesting that's it. Now go and do likewise. Because in the midst of chaos, it's very difficult to see anything other than the chaos, other than the suffering, other than the reality of pain. Perhaps it helps just a little bit to realize that's not the only picture there. That's not the only thing we see. It's just all that we're choosing to see because we tend to look right at things as opposed to past or beyond or around, or even to just stop, take a breath, and be still and wait for those things to suddenly crop up in the brush, where we can see it all much more clearly. In fact, funny, we didn't even know it was there. It was like a miracle almost. There's a way in which we can train ourselves to do that, but it's not easy. I recognize that it's hard to develop this whole discipline of sort of stopping for a moment and not letting our fear take us over, not letting our anxiety in the face of all the stuff that happens in the world take us over. I fly a lot. Now, I haven't been flying as much over the last 9 months or so after taking on this new position, but I fly a lot. And prior to this, I flew all the time, several times a week. And so I got pretty used to turbulence. I don't know, does turbulence, honestly, does it bother anybody in here? I mean, you're going to raise your hand, or you're just going to go like, not me, I'm seasoned traveler. I'm like, bumps? Hey, no worries here. Okay, I agree. On this flight to San Francisco, I was heading over towards San Francisco for a camp for kids with cancer. It was called Camp Sunshine Dreams, and it was at the Yosemite National Park. Beautiful camp for these kids who were experiencing terminal illness. And so I was flying over there, and I was reading a book, and it was one of these larger aircraft, so it had like 3, 5, and 3, and it was pretty packed. And somewhere over Nevada, we start hitting this massive turbulence. At first, it was like y'all thinking, it was that kind of mild little bounciness. You'd see a couple of people look up and kind of look around like, is anybody else scared? Is anybody else worried? And I kind of took a deep breath, and I was feeling kind of proud of myself, going like, nothing, this is good stuff, we're fine, this is good. And I thought, well, on the one hand, I'm a minister, and maybe I should just sort of, calm somebody beside me, going like, I think we're going to be okay. I've been traveling a lot. This happens all the time. And as I was thinking about that, we did one of these drops where it normally says you drop 50 to 100 feet is a pretty typical deal. We dropped like 1,000 feet. I mean, you could hear things rattling, the trays bounced up, things that 2 or 3 people screamed, and there was a couple of folks, they had to be Catholic, I guess, but they had their beads out and they were rubbing the beads. And I'm not kidding you here, there was anxiety present. And as we were flying, it just kind of kept getting worse. And I kept thinking, no, I've been through turbulence, but this was scary. It was uncertain. And I kept thinking to myself, just breathe. It's all right. It's a flight. These guys, they all know what they're doing. And I look over at this guy who's probably 25, and he looks at me and he says, I'm really anxious. Do you have a flask or anything like that, maybe? Because the flight attendants are not coming, right? They have to stay put. And he's going like, I could really use a little drink. Do you carry like those little travel bottles, And I'm going like, I wanted to go over like, I'm a priest. I don't do that kind of, but I just said I don't have that. And then I said, I think we're going to be okay. But I was anxious. And as it continued to do that, it just kind of kept up. It never calmed down. It just kept bouncing. And you hear the engine slow. And of course, I found out later on, it's kind of like a boat, right? It's kind of like a motorboat going through the waves on the water, so that when you're hitting these pockets, you kind of slow the engine down so that you can steady and then speed it up again. So they're constantly, in my mind, they're stalling. The engines are stalling. Right? I mean, that's what you think. Oh, my God, the engines are stalling. They just heard them shut down, and then they pick back up, and then it's motor problems, So all I see is fear. All I see is fear, and then the next thing takes over. As it gets rougher, and literally as people are starting to kind of cry a little bit, and there's some screaming, and one of the things pops open, one of the car, the car things above, and as it's going on, I'm thinking to myself, I'm only 45. This was a while back. But I'm thinking I'm 45 years old. And I've traveled and I've had some good experiences. But my kids, they haven't seen them. I mean, I'm going through the whole life passes forward. I'm not kidding. I mean, it's funny now, but I was anxious. I literally was anxious. I took out a pad of paper, and I still have it to this day. I started to write my wasn't the last will and testament, but I was like writing my last words of wisdom down. I was just kind of trying to be affirming, and it was scary. It was terrifying. It literally was. And I looked up at one moment, because I sit on the aisle. That's where I sit. And I looked down the aisle, and I saw the 2 flight attendants sitting there strapped in. And just as I looked up, I kid you not, the flight attendant looked at me from down there, and she just smiled. And she had the most gentle expression on her face. And then she just nodded, took a deep breath, closed her eyes, smiled again, and nodded. And just that moment, I felt just this wash over me. Just this gentle, quick comfort. She knows more than I know. She's calm as can be. And I looked over at the guy, and I kind of just grabbed his arm, and I said, I think we're going to be okay. Just take a deep breath. I'm going to take a deep breath. And so I took deep breaths for like the next 10, 15 minutes, but I just kept taking them. And every now and then I'd look up, and she wasn't just looking at me, but every now and then she'd look back over at me. But that's what she was doing with everybody. Anybody's eyes she could catch, she was smiling, taking a breath, and just nodding. I think that that's a lot of what it means to sow faith. It means to be open. And where it's difficult for us, sometimes we have to look to others. There's no question. But if they're not around, maybe we have to just ask ourselves, is this really the only thing here, or is it just the only thing I'm seeing? Maybe take a deep breath and accept that there's always mud before you can have a lotus. And they always go together. You can't have one without the other. Just to step back enough. And if it's not overwhelming you, maybe it's enough to simply be that presence for others. Amen.